Hi everyone, welcome to Uncommon Sense, the show from the Sociological Review Foundation where we take an everyday notion and see it kind of sideways, more critically, more sociologically. I'm Alexis Hutrong in Gatineau, Quebec, and I'm here with Rosie Hancock in Leipzig, Germany.
Hi Alexis, hi everyone. And today we're going to be thinking about therapy, psychoanalysis to be precise, and not how it shaped the way we speak, but instead how we listen. And specifically, how people in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, listen.
Indeed, you might not know this, but Buenos Aires is often described as the world capital of psychoanalysis. According to 2016 data from the World Health Organization, Argentina had 222 psychologists per 100,000 people, compared to a mere 30 in the US. Even the late Pope Francis, before he was Pope Francis, reportedly did 6 months of it in his early 40s. It's not very long, but still, right?
Well, speaking of durations, our guest, Xochitl Marsilli-Vargas, did 6 years of research, starting in 2012 in Buenos Aires, tuning into how the ubiquity of psychoanalysis has shaped how people interact with and hear each other there. Trained in social anthropology in Mexico City and New York City, Xochitl got her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in sociocultural and linguistic anthropology. And don't worry, one of our first questions is about exactly what that entails. And she's now an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Emory College of Arts and Sciences in the US. Her book, Genres of Listening, an Ethnography of Psychoanalysis in Buenos Aires, is the focus of our conversation today.
Hello, Rosie, and hello, Alexis. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. Now, Xochitl, you grew up in Mexico and did fieldwork in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And I'm curious to know, what took you there and how you came to settle on and decide this research project. What was it that made you think, there's something interesting going on here? So if you could sort of paint a picture for us of that little inkling that turned into what I think was 30 months of fieldwork.
Yeah, I mean, it was within a span of 6 years. So it's not that I was there for the whole time, but I grew up in Mexico in a place where mental health is something kind of like a taboo still. And also something that belongs to the middle classes, right? I mean, in the sense that it depends on where you are socially, whether or not you're going to seek mental health treatment. But even there, talking about your mental health problems, talking about yourself, it's something kind of taboo. And I visited Argentina many times because I have a lot of connections with friends and family, and being in Buenos Aires and seeing how everyone was talking about their therapy sessions, about their personal ideas, about their internal states, for me was a shock. Was like, wow, this is very interesting. So this is A, no taboo, and B, people are really open about this, and it's everywhere. And you start seeing it in the TV, in commercials, in magazines, in late night shows. So it was the strike difference between Mexico and Argentina in terms of speaking about your mental health issues that drove me to do fieldwork in Argentina.
Your training in linguistic anthropology kind of comes in here, yeah? Because you would have been maybe more alert than the average person to what was going on here in what you call a city of listeners. Can you tell us a bit more about what linguistic anthropology is, how it sharpens the senses?
So linguistic anthropology sits at the intersection of language and culture, but it has a distinctive set of commitments than just analyzing pure exchanges. So it is not primarily interested in grammar or syntax as the way linguistics, for instance, is, or not interested in social variabilities as sociolinguists do. But what linguistic anthropologists are fundamentally interested in is in how language and communication more broadly is constitutive of social life. So think about it. The way that we live in the world, the way that we think about it, it's through language. So that's what interests us. So one of our founding fathers or figures, his name was Del Hymes, coined the term ethnography of communication. And basically, it's the idea that you have to study communicative practices in their full social context with the methods of ethnography. So you have to learn the language, immerse yourself there, understand the full social context in which you are dealing with. Because we don't, as linguistic anthropologists, we don't take what people say at face value necessarily, right? But how do you say it? Why do you say that? What are the registers that you use? And especially lately, the idea of linguistic ideologies. So think about it. Language is not just to communicate things and ideas, but when we hear an accent and we immediately categorize that person as X, that's just linguistic ideology, right? I mean, like, it's not about language. It's about how people say things, right? And what the words they're using. So those are some of the things that we as linguistic anthropologists focus on. And the field has a strong tradition in what Roman Jakobson, which was a Russian-American linguist and literary theory, called the functions of language, right? So there is an emphatic, empathetic, there's poetic functions. So language does a lot of different things in the world. So linguistic anthropologists we are attuned to that. So when I went to Buenos Aires, my first idea was precisely to think about how people talk about psychoanalysis. And of course, I wanted to experience firsthand the clinical setting, which was impossible, as you can imagine, because it's a private contract. So I stumbled into this fantastic place, which is the multifamily therapeutic community at the Argentine Psychoanalytic Association, where you have like around 80 analyses and between 15 and 20 sometimes analysts there doing these psychoanalytic therapy sessions together. And that's where I was like, okay, I'm going to focus on language. How do they talk? What are the silences? What do they focus on? But then the listening question kept coming up, and that's when I switched my interest.
Yeah, so you did essentially conduct an ethnography of listening, and I would love to hear how you go about doing that. I mean, because listening is understood, I think, often as a sort of biological function, and often a really silent thing. And so how do you record it and how do you study it?
This is a great question, and a question that I really like to talk about, because it's a methodological problem, right? Whereas with speech, it's very easy to record, right? Right now, we're recording this session. So how do you do ethnographic of listening practices? And there are different ways to do this. So one is the most basic one, which is how do people talk about listening, right? Another way of going through it is the embodiment of listening. And why do I mean by this? So for instance, Charles Hirschkin, in his great book, Ethical Soundscapes, he talks about how, for instance, young Muslims in Cairo who were smoking, they stopped smoking when they started listening to these prayers. So basically, this shows you that they are listening in a particular way. It's an embodied form of listening. So that's another way in which you can analyze listening practices. And of course, the body dispositions, right? I mean, like empathetic listening. I mean, are you paying attention? How are you moving your body? But in my particular case, it was about what are some of the key phrases or moments in which that emerge during conversation that you can actually see like, oh, they are listening in a particular way. So it's a combination, right?
Yeah. So a lot of the time it's like listening emerges through a sort of like a dialogical encounter. And so then we can sort of listen to the listening. But I'm wondering, do you think doing this kind of work led you to become more aware of how you listen too?
Maybe this is a time to talk about how do I came about my idea of genres of listening. So I went to Buenos Aires, as you know, for a very long period of time, and I immersed myself into the Psi world, as they call it, right? So I went to this multifamily therapist that I was describing. I went to therapy, right? For the first time, I went to analysis as a participant observant, right? So I was there. I became kind of like a believer, to be honest. But at the beginning, I was just there to, okay, let's see what people do when they go to therapy. And third, well, you are just talking to friends and to acquaintances, and yeah. And I also took classes at the Lacanian School of Psychoanalysis and the Argentine Psychoanalytic Association. So I was just there trying to immerse myself. And yet I came back to the US empty-handed. Every time I came back, I was like, well, this is very interesting. And then I would talk to my advisors and they would be like, yeah, but where's the question? Where's the question? And I remember one of my advisors said, like, you have to let data speak to you, kind of like this almost mythical thing. So he said, put on your headphones when you're running, when you're doing the dishes, whenever, and listen to your recordings and see what you can hear, right? I mean, he didn't say that, but he's like, let the data speak to you. So at one point, literally washing dishes, I was listening to these multifamily sessions, and then suddenly everything came up together. Everything, it was like, oh, this is about listening. I mean, it was kind of in my face all the time, and I wasn't able to see it. And this is one of the characteristics of psychoanalytic listening that I found, which is that listening is cumulative, right? We tend to think that when we listen, it's like when you hear the knock of a door, right? Like, bah, bah, right? You listen, the sound comes, the sound goes, it's done. But what my research shows is that some kinds of listening, first of all, are learned, right? So it takes time to learn how to listen in a particular way, especially psychoanalytic listening, but also that it's cumulative, right? That sometimes you listen, and then at one point, all of that cumulative listening experience gets a concrete meaning. And I think that in this sense, psychoanalytic listening and anthropological listening are very, very similar. You listen, you record, you take notes, but there's a moment, right, in which you actually get that, oh, so this is what my project is about, because it's all of this cumulative listening. And I think that in the clinic specifically, it's about that, right? And that's why in psychoanalysis, it's so long. So one of the characteristics, again, of psychoanalytic listening is that it's cumulative. Another one is that it's a learned process in many cases. I mean, think about a doctor with the stethoscope, right? Listening to the sounds produced by your body. I mean, that's something that you have to learn. That's something that we might call semantic listening, right? Because you have particular sounds attached to meanings, right, that are kind of fixed, right? I mean, if the heart sounds in a particular way, or if your body, or when you cough, right, your lungs sound in a particular way, there's a particular sign assigned to that. Whereas other forms of listening, like psychoanalytic listening, which is more about suspending attention, right? I mean, the idea is that you're not going to focus necessarily on the words per se, but somehow what the words invoke in you. And then a third one, it's a very good one, I think, which is what the analyst told me. You have to listen from what they call in Spanish, from lo vivencial, or the lived experience, which basically means that you have to really let yourself resonate with the other person, right? So rather than, again, using a logical engagement with the words, you let yourself resonate, see how you feel.
On these aspects that you mentioned about learning and about like also listening to yourself and such, I suddenly become quite conscious of the way that I'm listening to you. So I'm kind of reflecting on that. It made me think about a situation where I was, when I was doing my PhD and in my fieldwork in Tokyo, I was speaking to a professor. And actually when we were discussing, he had his eyes closed, his head a bit down, listening surely quite intently. And afterwards, he provided me very generous feedback. But at the time, I was really worrying that I was being very boring. And so that it was a very different, culturally specific way of listening, right? But I kind of also learned to internalize that. And I think that now I do a kind of I close my eyes to listen, but then here it kind of clashes and people are sometimes like, yeah, what are you doing? Type of thing. You mentioned that what you observed kind of boiled down in many ways to a kind of like, when you say X, I hear Y formulation. Can you elaborate a bit on that, Xochitl? Tell us more why it struck you.
Well, one of the characteristics, again, of psychoanalytic listening is that what you say is not necessarily what you want to say, right? I mean, like the idea that your words betray you, and there's the famous slips of the tongue, right, that Freud discusses. So the main idea is that, yeah, when you say something, you might want to say something else, but you don't know, right? So again, this goes beyond the level of awareness. So for instance, to give you an example, in the multifamily sessions that I attended to, there was this woman who will raise her hand and will always tell the same story, right? I mean, like, well, everybody is mean to me. My kids don't come and visit. Everybody hates me. And she was kind of an annoying person in this setting. And every time she raised her hand, everybody was like, oh, here she goes again. And at one point, this other person who was present during that session raised his hand and he said, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I've been coming to these sessions for a year. And I am really sad to hear this lady repeating over and over the same story. I wonder what she really wants to tell us. And I just want to raise that. And an analyst was like, well, I'm so happy that you raised that, Juan, let's call him, because she touches in you something, right? So that compel you to actually, participate, right? And so when you say that her story keeps repeating and doesn't have any effect, it did have an effect on you. You felt compelled to talk. So that's an example of how, it's taken at face value in this setting that when you say something, you mean something else, right? And especially when you repeat a story, right? And this is what analysts will tell me. And that's why we're not interested in the referential meaning of words, but we're more interested in what the words, and the repetition, like, why are you saying that over and over? So I formulated that in a very, very short formula. When you say X, I hear Y. Because in everyday life in Buenos Aires, outside of the clinical setting, what I discover or what I experience is that when I was with friends and acquaintances, I would say something and they would say like, oh, Xochitl, what you really mean is X. And I was like, what? I just told you what I thought. And like, no, what you said sounded to me like, and that was a very big surprise to me. And I was like, wow. So I started following that, what you really mean is, because that sounded very interesting to me, but I still didn't think what was the value of that until I came back to the US. And then I talked to my advisors, to white men, very privileged and older. And when I told them about this, they were like, what? Somebody's telling me what I really mean? My most precious self? That's horrible. So they got so upset about it that I was like, wow, there is something interesting here. Why is this causing so much discomfort? It didn't to me. To me, it was more like I took that as almost like a friend telling me about my horoscope. Like, oh, you're a Pisces, so this is what I think happens to you or something. But no, so then this for me was kind of like the signature way in which we could see how psychoanalysis, which is one of the points I make in my book, have left the clinical setting and has become a way of listening socially.
I think it's so interesting what you just said about your advisors sort of being offended or sort of saying that they would be offended if someone said that to them. What you really mean is this, because that's sort of what I wondered, whether there are contexts or particular people for whom actually that would really get on their nerves. It seems like a power play. And is this sort of like, a sign of the psychologization of everyday conversation in particular contexts that's viewed in a negative, and it's viewed in a negative way, right? Like, well-being discourse and all of that. I'm just kind of curious, like, what's going on here when people are having these negative reactions to it? Because you seem very generous in your interpretation, like you're writing about like a positive interpretive stance on it.
Well, that's a great point, Rosie. Thank you for bringing it up. Every single time I present my work at any conference or any place, they're like, oh, this is a power trip. This is power just being totally like projected, right? Like you are interpreting people, you're imposing interpretation, right? And I'm like, actually, that's precisely not what is happening here. And one of the things that I really tell people is that I'm not interested. Yes, there is a way in which you could potentially see this as a power play, as an imposition of interpretation. But honestly, what I found out, is that people actually accepted the interpolation 99% of the times. In Argentina, right? I'm talking about Buenos Aires. So for them, it was not an issue. And secondly, I was more interested in not necessarily in this kind of analysis of critique, but I was interested more about how people experience this, and they experience them as positive, right? I mean, it was part of their everyday life. And I think that I'm more interested in how people, again, experience that in Buenos Aires rather than, and I think that in the US, Canada, or British Academy, we're so used to critique, right? I mean, and to always analyze everything under power struggle, which of course it's true. And you can make that analysis. I'm not saying not, but I'm from Berkeley, as you said. I was trained at Berkeley, and that's like the Foucault church, I will call it, right? So Foucault was there. So everything is always transversed by this power knowledge kind of. So I wanted to, I mean, I'm not interested in that reading, although of course I understand that it could be read as that.
I'd really like to hear more about your favorite anecdote, illustrations, hear maybe perhaps even more on experiences with taxi drivers in particular, because this is taking therapy speak and indeed like therapy listening to a whole new level that maybe, if we hear correctly, like transcends class in this particular context. Yes. And indeed, when you say psychoanalytic listening is a social fact, I think in your writings, right, as Marcel Mauss would call it in Buenos Aires. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Let me first address the class issue, right? Because this is one of the first things that people always tell me. I mean, like, isn't psychoanalysis just for the middle class, the educated middle class, and it's inexpensive? Well, first of all, part of my research implied, I mean, I really went to how do you get trained as an analyst? And a lot of people study psychology in the Buenos Aires University, which is free. And then I went to the last 30-year exams, and I discovered that in order to become a psychologist, not an analyst, you have to pass this 100-question exam. And for the past 30 years, between 55 and 49 questions were about psychoanalysis. So that was already interesting, that the way that they are trained in the public university as a psychologist, it's very much influenced by psychoanalysis. And therefore, they practice in a lot of public hospitals, right? I mean, so public clinics, because Argentina has a universal healthcare system. So therefore, anyone can go, I mean, for any different class strata and get like psychological services for free. But most likely these people are going to be attended by people who had been trained as in psychoanalysis. And a lot of them actually went on to have masters and other specialization in psychoanalysis besides their training in the public university. So what this means is that everyone has access to psychoanalysis in a way. And an anecdote that I have is that when I rented an apartment in Buenos Aires, it came with a service of cleaning, right? I mean, like a cleaning service came and cleaned the apartment once every 2 weeks. So I became friends with this woman. This woman was from a very working class background. She actually had to travel from the province of Buenos Aires, like almost 2 hours to get into my apartment, you know, but then we will always talk. And she one day, well, I saw her limping. And I was like, oh, Rosita, why did you came, right? I mean, if you don't feel great. And what she said was like, oh, no, don't worry, Xochitl. This is psychosomatic. Every time my son gets into trouble, I start feeling, I mean, all these ailments in my body. So I was like, oh, well, tell me a little bit more about this. And she said like, well, you know, it's all about the mind, you know, and how we process all of this trauma. I mean, she uses these words in the body. I mean, someone who can barely write, you know, and read. So that actually it's an example of how widespread these ideas about trauma, about psychosomatic, I mean, all of these things that circulate in Buenos Aires. And part of it is also that it's on in all of these advertisements. They advertise couches, right, with the stereotypical idea of an analyst, right? Like a man with a beard and like a jacket, and he goes to stores and, you know, lays down. They also sell literally chips. I mean, so this analyst is looking at his clock because he wants to eat chips. They advertise and, I mean, anything. So I think, again, these ideas, I mean, the media in one hand, but in the other hand, the fact that it's available to everyone in the hospitals, I think creates this awareness. And of course, the taxi drivers, which a lot of people have different anecdotes. And I mean, I have many. So I was with a friend in a cab, and then there was this group of kids crossing the street, and my friend said, "Oh, I don't like that combination of color, the uniforms." And the taxi driver was like, "Oh, nobody dislikes a color for no reason. Does your mother wears that color often?" And then 2 weeks later, my friend was like, "Oh, I feel so bad because I realized that my mother-in-law has a sweater with those colors, but I love my mother-in-law. So I got very conflicted." So the words travel, what in linguistics they have this speech act kind of meaning that words do things in the world, right? They linger.
I mean, that was just really fascinating to hear about how the psychoanalysis is so widely available both in terms of the number of people being trained in it, but also in terms of kind of the cost of it within Argentina, because, I wanted to know about why psychoanalysis has taken root so strongly in the city. And if I'm right, I guess there's not necessarily a single clear reason, although lots of ideas, and this is certainly like a really good one. And perhaps we can all pick up your book to read a bit more about that as well. But what I wanted to move on to now is how this kind of ubiquity of psychoanalytic listening relates to people's understanding of selfhood and kind of people's concept of the political, because I guess we're not just talking about small interpersonal stuff, and you're not just talking about the sort of small interpersonal stuff in your book either.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. Well, so I know you asked for why is this a social fact? So let me go back to that, and then I can respond to this question. So Mauss borrowed from his uncle Durkheim the concept of the social fact. He actually said the total social fact, Mauss. And a social fact, it's something that exists external to individuals and constrains or shapes their behavior. And this concept is useful in Argentina precisely because, as I mentioned, right, it surpasses class, gender, even the Pope, right? So it's everywhere. And how does this relate to personhood or to a form of being? Well, what I think it has to do with this particular way of understanding liberal theory. So if you actually think about psychoanalysis, you have to think about a particular way of understanding the self, right? I mean, the first thing is that you have an interior life, right? I mean, like that idea, it's not universal. We tend to think that it is, but as a lot of people working in New Guinea, right, in a lot of different places in the Pacific will tell you, this idea that we have an internal self that we can talk about, that we can discuss, is actually a very particular historical construction of the self. So, I mean, one of the things that I explore in the book is, so this form of listening, right, that actually it's attuned to the idea that you have, that yourself is unique, right, first of all. Right? I mean, and a lot of people like Chakravarti have explained how modernity actually for them, it is precisely with the birth of the biography, right? The idea of the uniqueness of the self. So it seems to me that the first thing that we need to think about when we think about listening in this particular way is that it points to a very particular way of understanding selfhood, right? And personhood. And it has to do with the liberal ideal of the rational self. But it's interesting because at the same time, it's in conflict with psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis, on the other hand, tells you, well, actually, you're a split subject, right? And maybe we can talk a little bit about what psychoanalysis is. But psychoanalysis, it started with Freud at the end of the 19th century, and it's a theory of the mind, but also of the self, that argues that there are unconscious drives inside of us, right? So therefore that we're not aware of, but that somehow they shape the way that we think, the way that we behave. Again, all of these are particular ways of understanding the self. So what I found really interesting is this tension within being a rational self, right? And who has an internal self, which is individual, but at the same time, psychoanalysis kind of like disrupts that, because there is not really a rational self, because all of what you do is actually unconscious in a way. So my idea of thinking about the political, right, in this particular way is that when we think about psychoanalysis there is a philosopher, Jill Stauffer. She wrote about what she calls ethical loneliness. And what she says is that who gets hurt and who doesn't get hurt, right? So she's especially working with victims of genocides and victims of horrible conflict. And what she said also, so there's the the politics of listening, right? Who gets hurt, who doesn't get hurt. So I think that listening, again, it's not a neutral thing that is just a biological reception of sounds. You learn it, you make decisions, and it's political in the sense that you decide who do you listen to, who you don't listen to, but also about how it creates personhood and particular subjects.
Like, as you point out, like identifying the genre of psychoanalytic listening shows us that actually there are other genres also out there to write of listening. Can you reflect a bit on the implications that your study has for thinking about listening more broadly, basically? And kind of as an extra, also, would there be, we mentioned the negatives, right? So the negative genres of listening too.
So yeah, the concept of genre, it's one that I borrowed from Mikhail Bakhtin, which was a Russian literary theorist who foregrounded the social multi-voice nature of language. And so a genre refers to a recognizable, recurrent form of communicative action that has both formal features and social functions. So when I describe psychoanalytic listening as a genre, I mean it has a distinctive, learnable, recognizable shape that's tied to a particular social purpose and institutional context. So yes. So the whole point of thinking about genres of listening and using psychoanalytic listening as an example was to open the door to, well, are there other genres that have this recognizable structure that you can actually follow? And of course, I said yes. So let's use this to understand how can we actually, by focusing on genres of listening, we can learn more about institutional settings and other social relations. And my recent work on asylum adjudications, actually, I think it's a good way of talking about another form of listening that I found. When I interviewed one of the USCI agents, so the migration agents in the United States, she told me, in this job, you learn to listen to lies. So for me, that was like, wait, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to learn to listen to lies? And I think that this is what I can call maybe suspicious listening. I don't know. I don't have a name for that, but it's a particular genre, right? It's you're positioning your ear to find the discrepancies, right? To find the hesitancies. So that's, for instance, a great example of another genre, right? That you learn that it's institutional and that if you don't pay attention to that, you are going to miss out on why some people get denied asylum, right? It's not because they don't deserve it, but the way that they tell their story doesn't comply to a particular way of listening that we have. Oh, a story has to have a beginning and then, right, this particular structure. And another example, of course, empathetic listening, which is very different from psychoanalytic listening, which is the form of listening that most psychological therapeutic systems in the US use, right? They want to affirm you, right? They want to say that you're fine, rather than disrupt, which psychoanalysis sometimes they do. So I think that all of these things can be conceptualized as genres.
So Alexis mentioned the possibility of negative genres of listening, and feels like the world is pretty stuck at the moment in terms of, how we listen to each other and whether we actually are learning from any of the listening and so on, particularly politically. You did this research a while back. Do you have a sense whether anything's changed, either in Buenos Aires or more broadly?
Well, yeah, in Buenos Aires, unfortunately, now they have a disaster of a president called Javier Milei, who is a right-wing populist. But it's interesting because, yes, one of the things that when I've been back to Buenos Aires, just visiting friends, not doing research, I realized that they are more and more now interested in neurosciences, right? And that's, I think, the paradigm that is moving, and maybe in some years will replace psychoanalysis. But again, Milei being this very wild figure, right? He sometimes acts very, very strange, right? He talks to his dead dogs in open TV, and asks for advice. There's a lot of psychoanalysts discussing him in the media, again, in the newspapers, in places saying like, well, Milei, it's because he had a father who castrated him, like using all of these psychoanalytic nomenclatures and concepts to describe his very chaotic government. So I think that psychoanalysis is still there, but it's a great question, Rosie, about the negative of listening, right? I mean, right now, part of my research also, in this forensic listening that I'm interested in, is what happens when you are listened by a chatbot. More and more in the US, for instance, they are using chatbots for the first interview for mental health assessment. So it's not a person. You're telling your most intimate stuff to a chatbot called Avi, by the way. So those are things that we need to consider now. So what happens when a chatbot is listening? I don't know the answer to that, but I know it's happening. So I think that this can open the possibility to explore more the negative. What is it when there are not even humans, right?
Hi, it's Alice. I produce Uncommon Sense. Thanks for listening. Two things we really want to let you know about today. The first is the Sociological Review Foundation's public lecture, which this year is on the 2nd of September at SOAS in London. It's with the science journalist Angela Saini, and it's called Anatomy of a Myth. It's on the fatal consequences of sorting people by race and sex. So how gender, race and history continue to shape critical aspects of our lives, from medical diagnoses to government policies. You can get your tickets on our website or via the link in our show notes. And as we always remind you, we are a charity. We're the home for sociological curiosity. We believe sociology is a really important tool for understanding, but also changing the world around us. And this podcast is a big part of working towards that change. If you like what you hear and you'd like to directly support the making of this show, head to our donor box page at donorbox.org/uncommon-sense. That's also in our show notes to make a contribution. We're grateful for your support. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so we're back and wanted to talk to you more about psychoanalysis. You touched a bit already on what it means to take a kind of psychoanalytic approach to selfhood, but there are different kind of types, I guess, of psychoanalysis, or different schools of psychoanalysis. And there's a guy called Lacan who pops up in your book quite a lot. And so I was wondering if we could hazard a description of what we mean when we say Lacanian.
So psychoanalysis is both, as I mentioned, a theory of the mind and a clinical practice originated with Freud in Vienna at the end of the 19th century. And the core theoretical commitments are that much of our mental life is unconscious, that unconscious material nevertheless, somehow dominates our waking life, if we might. And they actually, and this is interesting, right? They talk about the talking cure, right? So for Freud, it was just about speech, right? If you talk about it, then we'll be able to listen to the unconscious, etc. But within psychoanalysis, there are many different schools and many different theoretical traditions. And what's distinctive in Buenos Aires, as you very well pointed, Rosie, and about Argentina more broadly, is the overwhelming dominance of Jacques Lacan and Lacanian psychoanalysis. So Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst working in the mid-20th century who returned to Freud through the lens of structural linguistics. So for Lacan, the unconscious is structured like a language. And this is very different from Freud. What does this mean? It means that desire is always mediated by what he calls the signifier. What we want is never quite what we think we want. It is always displaced, deferred. So for him, so structural linguistics in a nutshell, it's a response to evolutionism, right? The idea that there are some languages that are better than others, right? Or the history of language in a diachronic way. So structural linguistics is like, no, actually there is a structure of language inside our heads. It's almost like a hard drive, right? And it doesn't matter what language you speak. All of the languages are equally different, but it's about the substitutions, right? So there is a structure and you just substitute particular words for others, but the structure remains the same. So for Lacan, who was very much influenced by Jacobson and by Saussure, and then Lévi-Strauss, right? Famous structural anthropologists said what we should do is look for this structure, right? So let's take away all the context and let's just focus on that structure. So for Lacan, the unconscious was formulated by what he said notes or these signifiers, right? Throughout the speech so let's say I tell a story and then I keep saying father, 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 right? Throughout all the context. So for him, it's an anchor, a node, a signifier, but it doesn't matter, right? The context where I mention it, it always appears. So that's very interesting, right? Because then the idea is that the psychoanalyst, the trained psychoanalyst, can listen and find those nodes and somehow be able to give a structure to your unconscious. Now, why Lacan dominates El Río de la Plata, right, which is that area, Buenos Aires, it's a fascinating question that a lot of people have tried to answer, and nobody really knows the specific answer. But I can just very briefly say that some of the things that they said is, of course, the French intellectual influence of Argentine in universities, the fact that when the psychology subject at the university was created, they didn't have really any psychologists. So they brought like philosophers and humanists. So it always colored psychology with a more humanistic taste. These are speculation. These are a combination of reasons of why maybe Lacan has been so prevalent.
Could you elaborate a bit more on how or where does psychoanalysis kind of meet anthropology and sociology?
Both sociology and anthropology at their core are committed to the idea that reality is not what it appears, right? That there's a surface of social life that somehow conceals these structures that we were talking about, dynamics and different forces, and that they need to be excavated, right? And that's the social scientist's role, is to actually go beyond what's evident, right? So in this particular way, it actually connects very neatly with the idea of psychoanalysis, right? Which is like, there are things that you see that are out there in the world, but actually there's a meaning behind it. And also Franz Boas, who is one of the, fathers of the fourth field anthropology in the United States, he talked about secondary rationalization. So this idea that you have what the people that, your subjects, right? The people that you're studying, what are the rationalizations that they have, which he calls second order. And then there is the anthropologist, right? The social scientist who is going to really discover, right? Like the structures, the functions, everything behind the evidence, right? So I think that the social sciences and the psychoanalysis has this in common, but also, of course, a lot of humanistic and philosophical people like the Frankfurt School, for instance. We're talking about Adorno, Horkheimer, Affront, Marcuse, all of these people who were very, very Marxist, right? They're the Marxists of the mid-20th century, social theorists, but they were deeply committed to psychoanalysis, right? So they used Freudian concepts to theorize authoritarianism, mass culture. So they were all very much influenced by psychoanalysis. So the entanglement between psychoanalysis and critical social theory has been there from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. There's as a discipline, this kind of working on the collective unconscious, right? There's this aspect, and it does feel like Lacan is kind of like a cool author, right? That people get to a bit later in their careers sometimes. But finally, Xochitl, would you like to tell us a bit more about your current work and what kind of listening are you presently applying for that?
Yes, I'm working on two projects. One is one that I call Silencing as Care. And this is about the adjudicated system of asylums in the United States, although, as you can imagine, right now that has been paused because there are no asylums in the United States under the current administration. But this is a work that I did back in the day when I was a student at Berkeley. I served as a translator between unaccompanied minors who were coming from mostly Latin American countries into the country soliciting for asylum. So I was very much interested in what I call the politics of vulnerability. So how vulnerability is constructed verbally, right? Discursively, because these kids or minors, right? They are spoken through the whole process of the interview, of how, even when they are constructing their own narratives and testimonies. So I was interested in, or I am interested in, this idea of vulnerability and translation and what all of the things that happen during the actual interview to be granted asylum or not. And that's when I also realized that listening was very much present there. And I'm interested also in analyzing this idea of suspicious listening. And my other project, which is really, really beginning, is forensic listening and the chatbots and mental health.
Xochitl, thanks so much for joining us today. It's made me, particularly reflective about how I listen and why I listen in the way I do. We're going to put everything that you've referenced in the show today into our show notes, like we always do.
Thank you, Rose.
We're off for summer break over August, but we'll be back in September. In the meantime, why not enjoy our episode on listening with Les Back, which is a really great partner show to this one with Xochitl.
And do also take a moment to complete our listener survey. It's in our show notes. It's there to help us listen to you. And it takes only a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Our producer is Alice Block. Our sound engineer is Dave Crackles. Thanks for listening. Bye.